The ranch stretched so far into the horizon that a man could ride for a whole day and still not reach its end. From the first light of dawn until the final glow of sunset, the land glimmered in golden hues, tall grasses waving like an endless ocean beneath the sky. Herds of cattle moved slowly across the fields, their low voices rumbling like distant thunder. Fences lined the open plains, stretching mile after mile, marking the domain of one of the wealthiest men in the territory, the rancher. He was not an ordinary man of the frontier. While others struggled to protect their small herds or feared the storms that could wipe out a season's labor, this rancher lived as though fate itself bent to his will. His barns were always full, his cattle always fat, his horses strong and sleek. He had men working under him, cowhands who rose before the sun and did not rest until the night was deep. They feared his temper, but respected his power. When he rode out across his land, his boots polished, his coat lined with the finest wool from the east, everyone who saw him tipped their hats. To the townsfolk, he was the image of success. He owned not just land, but influence. Merchants welcomed him with wide smiles, offering the best cuts of fabric, the sweetest tobacco, the rarest tools. The banker shook his hand as though shaking hands with fortune itself. Mothers pointed him out to their children, whispering, "That man is rich, richer than anyone for 100 miles." To the common eye, his life was perfect, built upon the sweat of his own work and the luck of his father and grandfather before him. But hidden beneath the polished surface of his wealth was a restlessness, a kind of emptiness he would never admit. For him, wealth was both armor and weapon. He clung to it, defended it, and measured himself only through its shadow. In every handshake he looked for respect. In every passing glance he searched for admiration. He loved the sight of envy in men's eyes as though it proved he had won the battle of life. Yet there was something he feared more than poverty itself: weakness. The rancher despised weakness in any form. A man with a broken leg was useless to him. A horse that stumbled was sent away. A cow that failed to give milk was slaughtered. To his mind, everything had to earn its place, had to prove its worth every single day. Strength, youth, productivity, these were his commandments. He repeated them like prayers. And because of this, his men worked harder, his herds grew larger, and his name traveled farther. Yet the same creed that made him powerful also made him blind. For in his very home, under his very roof, lived the one man who had given him everything: his grandfather. Once the old man had been strong, perhaps stronger than the rancher himself. He had carved the ranch out of wilderness, fought through storms and droughts, driven cattle across dangerous rivers, and faced men who tried to steal from him. It was his blood and sweat that laid the foundation for all the wealth that now glittered so proudly in his grandson's hands. But time is cruel, and strength is fleeting. The old man's hands trembled now when he lifted a cup. His voice had softened like dry leaves rustling in the wind. His steps were slow, and his body bent forward as though the years weighed heavily upon him. The rancher saw this every day. At first he tried to ignore it, but with every passing season, the frailty of his grandfather became more obvious. A man who could once tame a wild horse now struggled to rise from a chair. A man who once gave orders now asked for help with the simplest of tasks. To the rancher, who worshipped strength, this was unbearable. He looked at his grandfather not as a living legacy, but as a reminder of what age could do, what weakness could become. And deep inside, though he never admitted it, he was afraid of becoming like him. The town, however, still showed the old man respect. Some of the elders remembered him in his youth, when he stood tall with a rifle across his shoulder, defending the ranch with nothing but courage and grit. They remembered his laughter, his generosity, his wisdom. They spoke kindly of him in the saloon and in the market. "That old man," they would say, "he's the reason this ranch even exists." Without him, there would be no wealth, no land, no cattle. But the rancher only tightened his jaw when he heard such words. To him, the past was past. What mattered was now, and in the now, the old man could no longer pull his weight. Suspense hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The ranch looked calm on the outside, cattle grazing, cowhands working, the rancher standing tall. But inside the house there was tension. The grandfather sat quietly most of the time, his eyes distant, as though looking back on a life only he could see. He would sometimes try to offer advice, soft words drawn from decades of experience, but the rancher brushed them aside. "That was your time," he would say. "This is mine." The words cut like knives, but the old man bore them without complaint. At night, when the lamps burned low and the prairie winds howled against the windows, the rancher sometimes found himself listening to the faint shuffle of the old man's footsteps across the wooden floor. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, annoyed by the sound, and wonder how long it would last. He told himself that the ranch was no place for weakness, no place for frailty. Yet even as he thought this, some part of him, a part buried deep under years of pride, felt a tug of unease. Still, he pushed the feeling away. He told himself he was right, that the world rewarded only the strong. He believed that to keep his empire alive, he must cut away anything that slowed him down. And so, day after day, he hardened his heart further. He polished his boots, he signed his contracts, he rode across his land like a king surveying his kingdom, and he ignored the silent figure in the corner of his house who had once been his guide, his protector, his teacher. The wealth was vast, the respect from others unshaken, but in the rancher's home, the shadow of a decision was growing, a decision that would soon reveal what kind of man he truly was. The rancher's name carried weight in every corner of the nearby town. When his boots struck the wooden boards of the main street, people turned their heads. Shopkeepers rushed to straighten shelves. Children tugged on their mothers' sleeves, whispering, "That's him." He had become a symbol, larger than the man himself. His wealth painted him as untouchable, as though dust itself dared not cling to his coat. In the saloon, his entrance silenced conversations. Cards were lowered, dice paused mid-roll, and men raised their glasses to him as though greeting a visiting dignitary. He nodded in return, the faintest smile tugging at his lips, not of kindness, but of satisfaction. This was the world he had built, the power he craved. But behind those nods and smiles lay whispers. Some respected him out of fear, not admiration. Some muttered when his back was turned, saying he had grown too proud, too cold. Still, the rancher thrived on appearances. Every gesture, every glance was calculated to reinforce his image as the strongest man in the territory. He bought the finest whiskey, not because he needed it, but because it proved he could afford it. He wore the sharpest coats, imported from distant cities, so no one could mistake him for an ordinary cattleman. Even his horses were chosen for their beauty and strength, black stallions that snorted fire when they galloped through the streets. To the casual eye, he was a man who lacked nothing, yet every show of strength carried a shadow. In quiet moments, when the crowd was gone and the echo of boots faded, a silence crept over him. He would walk into his grand house, its walls lined with trophies and polished wood, and find his grandfather sitting alone by the fire. The old man did not speak much anymore. His eyes lingered on the flames as though they carried memories from long ago, memories of battles fought, cattle driven, storms endured. The rancher rarely sat beside him. He felt uncomfortable in that silence, as though it accused him of something unspoken. At times, the old man tried to share a story. His voice, though weak, carried weight. He would begin, "I remember when the land was nothing but wild grass and danger." But before the tale could grow, the rancher would cut him off. "The land is tamed now," he would say sharply. What matters is what we do today, not yesterday. Each dismissal dimmed the light in the old man's eyes a little more. Still, the grandfather never raised his voice. He accepted the coldness with a grace that puzzled the ranch hands who noticed. Some of them, men hardened by labor, still tipped, their hats respectfully to the old man, muttering, "He's the real reason this place stands." But the rancher brushed such comments aside, claiming his grandfather lived only in the past. Suspense deepened with each passing week. The rancher's obsession with power grew stronger, while the frailty of the grandfather became harder to ignore. The sight of his trembling hands disturbed him. The sound of his slow, uneven footsteps at night grated on his nerves. Each cough, each pause of breath seemed to the rancher like a reminder of weakness, of decline, of death itself. And he hated it. He told himself that weakness was contagious, that if he allowed it under his roof, it would infect the whole ranch. A man who tolerated frailty was no true leader. These were the thoughts that circled in his mind as he rode across his empire, as he signed deals in town, as he drank the finest whiskey in the saloon. They haunted him like shadows on the prairie, whispers he could not silence. The townsfolk noticed changes too. Some said he had grown colder, harsher with his men. Orders were barked instead of spoken. Punishments came swiftly for the smallest mistakes. His eyes, once sharp with confidence, now carried a restlessness, a hunger that could not be satisfied. Behind the respect he demanded lay an edge of fear, and all the while the old man remained in the grand house, fading slowly like a candle burning down to its last flame. His presence, though quiet, was heavy. He had no riches left, no strength to offer, yet his very being reminded the rancher of truths he did not want to face. That wealth is temporary, that power fades, that every man will one day bend under the weight of years. The suspense was not in what had already happened, but in what was coming. The rancher's pride and the grandfather's frailty were on a collision course, and the decision the rancher would make was already forming in the darkness of his heart. The land might have seemed peaceful, the cattle grazing, the sun setting in golden splendor, but under that peace lay the tension of an unspoken storm. One evening, as the prairie winds howled and clouds gathered over the distant mountains, the rancher stood at the window of his home. He watched the old man in the corner, hunched and still, the firelight flickering across his lined face. For a moment, something stirred in the rancher, pity perhaps, or memory. But just as quickly, it hardened into something else, resentment. That night, the decision took root. The rancher told himself he would not let weakness rule his house, not even in the form of blood. The wealth he had built, the empire he commanded, none of it could afford the weight of a man who could no longer stand strong. He believed that by casting out the frailty, he would secure his own strength forever. He did not know then that in trying to protect his legacy, he was about to lose the most valuable part of it. The ranch remained vast, the town still bowed to him, the cattle grazed as always. Yet in the silence of that home, by the dying fire, the balance of everything was about to shift, and the storm, long hidden, was finally preparing to break. The old man had once been a figure of strength, the kind of man who could bend the land to his will. In his youth, he had carried logs on his shoulders, dug wells with his bare hands, and tamed wild horses that even the bravest cowhands feared to touch. The ranch that now stretched across miles of open prairie had grown from his sweat and sacrifice. When the storms came, it was he who stood at the gates, defending his herd. When raiders threatened, it was his steady hand that raised the rifle. For decades, he had been the backbone of his family, the guardian of its wealth and the soul of its honor. But time does not bow to even the strongest men. The same hands that once gripped a rope tight now trembled when holding a cup. His voice, which had commanded men and calmed frightened cattle, had grown thin and brittle, like wind passing through dry grass. The eyes that once scanned the horizon for danger now struggled to read the simple lines of a newspaper. Where he had once ridden horses with fire in his blood, he now walked slowly, leaning on a stick, each step measured and heavy. The rancher saw these changes every day. At first, he tried to deny them, telling himself that his grandfather was simply tired, that he would recover his strength. But the truth was clear. Age had stolen what no man could reclaim. The grandfather no longer belonged to the world of strength and speed. His body had betrayed him, and the rancher began to see him not as the man who built their fortune, but as a burden. The old man, however, carried his weakness with quiet dignity. He never complained, even when his hands shook and he spilled water. At the table, he would softly smile and whisper, "Clumsy me." When his voice cracked and he could not finish a story, he would bow his head in silence rather than force the words. He did not argue with his grandson's sharp remarks. He did not defend himself when called useless. He simply accepted his frailty as the natural way of life. To him, weakness was not shameful. It was the truth of years lived long and hard. But to the rancher, this acceptance felt like surrender. He could not understand how a man who had once been so strong could bear to sit quietly by the fire, doing nothing. He mistook patience for laziness, silence for weakness, humility for defeat. And the more he saw of his grandfather's frailty, the more restless he became. The rancher's world revolved around strength, wealth, and productivity. To watch a man he had once admired sink into the slow pace of old age felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. At the dinner table, the tension grew sharp. The rancher would sit tall, his coat clean, his boots shining, his voice firm. The grandfather would sit opposite him, shoulders slumped, hands unsteady as he lifted a spoon. Sometimes the spoon would fall, clattering against the plate. The rancher's jaw would tighten, his eyes narrowing in quiet disgust. He would not shout. His silence was worse. The old man would notice, of course, and with a trembling hand he would wipe the spill, whispering an apology that was never answered. At night, the sound of his grandfather coughing echoed through the grand house. The rancher would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the noise gnawing at him. To him, the house was meant to be a symbol of power, a fortress of success. But the cough, the shuffle of tired feet, the quiet sighs, these sounds weakened that image, reminding him that decay lived within his walls. He grew to resent them, to resent the man who made them. And yet, the grandfather was not without value. He still carried within him stories that no book could hold, wisdom that no banker could sell. Sometimes, when the ranch hands gathered by the fire outside, the old man would sit with them. His voice might have been weak, but his words carried weight. He spoke of droughts that had nearly starved them, of rivers crossed under lightning storms, of wolves driven away by fire and courage. The young men listened in awe, their eyes wide, as though they sat at the feet of a legend. For to them, the old man's weakness did not erase his past, it magnified it. But the rancher never joined those circles. He told himself he was too busy, too important to waste time on old tales. In truth, he could not bear to see others respect the very man he had begun to despise. It felt like an insult to his own power, a shadow over his own pride. He did not realize that what those men admired was not weakness, but the endurance of a man who had given his strength to the land until nothing was left. Suspense grew thicker with every day. The grandfather weakened, the rancher hardened, and the distance between them widened like a canyon. The old man's eyes still held kindness, still offered forgiveness in every glance. But the rancher's eyes grew colder, sharper, filled with a judgment that no mercy softened. The house became a silent battlefield where no words were spoken, but every look, every pause, every sigh carried the weight of unspoken conflict. The grandfather knew, deep down, that his time in the house was ending. He could feel it in the way his grandson looked at him, in the impatience that boiled just beneath the surface. He had built the ranch with his bare hands, but now he sat like a stranger in his own home. And though he never said it aloud, though he never begged for kindness, a sorrow lingered in his heart, a sorrow deeper than weakness itself, the sorrow of being unwanted by his own blood. That sorrow would soon meet its breaking point. For weakness, though quiet, has a way of testing strength, and the decision the rancher was preparing to make would not only measure his wealth or his pride, but his very soul. The night was heavy with silence. Outside, the prairie stretched wide under a silver moon, the cattle asleep in the fields, the wind whispering through the grass. Inside the grand ranch house, a different storm was gathering, one made not of thunder, but of choice. The wealthy rancher sat alone at the long oak table, a single lamp flickering at his side. Papers lay scattered before him, contracts, accounts, maps of land expanding farther than the eye could see. All spoke of his power, his control, his success. Yet his mind was not on wealth tonight. His thoughts circled again and again around one man, his grandfather. The old man's coughing had been worse that evening. During supper he had spilled his drink again, water dripping across the fine tablecloth. His trembling hands had reached for a napkin, and with a cracked voice he whispered, "Forgive me." The rancher's face had burned hot with shame. Not shame for his grandfather, but shame for himself, for being tied to weakness, for allowing it to sit at his table. He could not stand the sight any longer. He could not bear the sound of frailty echoing through the halls he had built with pride. He rose from the table now, pacing the room, boots thudding against the polished wood floor. His mind raced with thoughts darker than the night. He is a burden, he told himself. The ranch has no place for weakness. My men respect me because I am strong. What will they think if they see me protecting a frail, useless old man? His jaw tightened, his fists clenched. The words burned in his mind. Useless, burden, shame. But beneath those harsh thoughts, another voice whispered. It was quieter, gentler, the voice of memory. He remembered, against his will, how his grandfather had once lifted him onto a horse when he was a boy, teaching him to ride. He remembered strong hands guiding him, steady eyes watching over him. He remembered nights by the fire when the old man told stories that filled his young heart with courage. For a moment, that memory softened him. His steps slowed, his breath caught. "He gave me everything," the voice whispered. "Without him, there would be no ranch, no wealth, no me." The rancher froze. His heart pounded. Two forces battled inside him: gratitude and pride, love and ambition. The shadows in the room seemed to lean closer, waiting for his choice. The lamp flickered, casting his face half in light, half in darkness, as if the world itself reflected his struggle. At last his pride spoke louder. He could not escape it. He saw his grandfather not as the man of his childhood, but as the frail figure bent over the table, coughing, shaking, spilling food like a child. The rancher's lips curled with bitterness. A man who cannot even lift a spoon does not belong here, he thought. He holds me back. He stains my name. And so, the decision formed in his mind, cold, sharp, and final. He would cast his grandfather out. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Not because it was cruel. He had convinced. Himself it was necessary, but because it carried weight. This was no small act. To send away a man of his own blood, the very man who built the foundation of his life, was to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Yet the rancher told himself it was strength. "The world respects the strong," he whispered. "I cannot let pity weaken me." He imagined how it would happen. In the morning, he would speak the words plainly, without hesitation. He would tell his grandfather that his place was no longer here, that he should leave and find his own way. Perhaps he would send him to a poorhouse in town. Perhaps he would simply leave him at the edge of the prairie where someone else might take pity. The details did not matter. What mattered was that the ranch would be free, free from the weight of weakness. As he stood by the window staring out at the endless land, his reflection stared back at him in the glass. For the first time, he did not see himself as a man, but as something colder, harder, like stone. The silence in the room pressed in on him, heavy and accusing. Yet he did not falter. The decision had been made. That night, the grandfather lay in his room at the far end of the hall. His breathing was uneven, his body weary, but his mind awake. He felt the change in the house. He felt the sharpness in his grandson's eyes, the coldness in his voice. Though no words had been spoken, the old man knew. He could sense it the way a bird senses a storm. His time here was over. He turned his face to the ceiling, whispering a prayer into the stillness. Not a prayer for himself. He was ready for whatever fate awaited him, but for his grandson, who had lost sight of the heart beneath his wealth. Tears welled in his eyes, though he tried to hide them even in the dark. His body was weak, but his spirit was still strong enough to ache for the boy he had raised, the boy who no longer saw him as family. Morning would bring the cruel decision into the light. Morning would tear apart blood and history. Morning would test not only the old man's endurance, but the very soul of the ranch itself. For in casting out the grandfather, the rancher believed he was proving his strength. But in truth, he was opening a door he did not yet understand. Beyond that door waited judgment, not from men of wealth, but from those who saw deeper, those who measured honor not by cattle or land, but by loyalty and respect. And when that judgment came, it would shake the rancher's world in ways he could not yet imagine. The lamp burned low. The rancher sat back at the table, his face hard, his eyes unblinking. The grandfather coughed in the distance, the sound fragile and small. The rancher closed his eyes, sealing his choice in silence. The cruel decision was made. The morning came with a cruel brightness. The sun rose over the wide prairie, spilling gold across the ranch lands. Yet inside the great house there was no warmth. The wealthy rancher stood in the hallway, boots polished, hat in hand, his face hard as stone. Every movement was deliberate, every breath heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. Today he would carry out the choice he had made in silence the night before. Today he would cast out his grandfather. The old man sat in a wooden chair by the window of his room. His thin hands rested on his knees, his back slightly bent, but his eyes remained sharp, clear as the morning sky. He had dressed himself with care, wearing the same worn coat he had kept since his younger years, a coat that smelled faintly of smoke and leather. Though his body trembled, his spirit held steady. He knew what was coming. A man did not raise a boy to manhood without learning how that boy thought. The old man had felt the chill in his grandson's heart long before this moment arrived. The rancher entered the room without knocking. His shadow stretched across the floor, tall and imposing. For a moment he looked at his grandfather in silence, as though waiting for weakness to reveal itself, as though hoping the old man would crumble before a single word was spoken. But the grandfather did not bend. His eyes met his grandson's with calm acceptance, and this only made the rancher's jaw tighten. "It's time," the rancher said at last. His voice was low, controlled, stripped of any tenderness. "You can't stay here anymore. The ranch has no place for the old or the weak." The words cut the air like a knife. The old man did not flinch. He simply nodded once, slowly, as though he had been expecting this exact sentence. "So it has come to this," he whispered. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled in his lap. "Your wealth is large, but your heart is small. The rancher turned his face away, unwilling to hear. "This is not about heart," he snapped. "This is about survival, about strength. I built this empire, and I will not let it be stained by weakness." The old man rose with effort, leaning on the chair for balance. He stood, frail yet tall in dignity, his eyes never leaving his grandson. "You built nothing alone," he said. "These lands were earned with sweat that was not only yours." "You forget too quickly." The rancher's mouth twisted, but he did not answer. He only pointed to the door. "Leave. Before the men see you, go into town. Someone will take you in, but not here. Not under my roof." A silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the morning sounds of the ranch continued as if nothing had changed. The lowing of cattle, the distant call of a rider, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Life moved forward, blind to the breaking of blood ties inside the house. The old man bent down slowly, picked up a small leather bag that had been waiting at his side. Inside were only a few belongings: a folded blanket, a worn Bible, a pocket knife dulled by years of use. He carried nothing else. All that mattered to him had been taken already, not in objects, but in the rejection of his own flesh and blood. As he walked to the door, the floorboards creaked under his weak steps. The rancher followed him, silent, watching with cold eyes. The hallway seemed longer than it had ever been, each step echoing like a drumbeat of finality. At the front door, the old man paused, looking out at the bright morning. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the fresh prairie air, as if to take with him one last memory of the home he had built, the land he had once tilled with his own hands. Before stepping outside, he turned to his grandson one final time. His voice was soft, but the words struck harder than any shout. "One day you will learn what strength truly means, but by then it may be too late." The rancher's face hardened. He gave no reply. The old man stepped out into the morning sun. His figure, bent but unbroken, moved slowly down the dirt path leading away from the house. The rancher watched him go, arms crossed, his chest rising and falling with a breath he did not release until the figure had grown small against the vast horizon. Behind him, some of the ranch hands had gathered quietly. They had seen the old man leave. They had seen his bag, his slow walk, his lonely figure fading into the distance. They whispered among themselves, but none dared to speak aloud. Their respect for the rancher's power held their tongues, but their hearts felt the weight of what they had witnessed. Inside, the rancher closed the door firmly, as though sealing away not just his grandfather, but the past itself. The house felt colder now, despite the bright sun pouring through the windows. Shadows lingered in the corners, as if the spirit of what he had cast out still haunted the walls. That night, when the house grew silent and the fire burned low, the rancher lay awake in his bed. Sleep would not come. He heard echoes in the dark, the sound of his grandfather's cough, the memory of his gentle voice telling stories by the fire when he was a boy. Each memory gnawed at him, but he forced them aside, telling himself again and again it was necessary, it was strength, it was survival. Yet deep down he felt a hollow space forming, a void no wealth could fill. He had chosen power over blood, pride over love. And though no one had judged him yet, though the world outside still bowed before his wealth, he sensed that judgment was coming. From where, he did not know. But it was closer than he dared to imagine. The prairie night stretched wide and endless, the stars cold above the silent ranch. The old man walked alone, his shadow swallowed by the darkness. Each step carried him farther from the home he had built, yet closer to a fate the rancher could not foresee. And soon the cruel expulsion would echo beyond the house, beyond the ranch, beyond the town, drawing eyes that would see not weakness, but honor, and deliver a judgment the rancher could not escape. The prairie stretched wide beneath the moonlight. The old man walked slowly, leaning on his stick, his breath shallow but steady. Each step sank into the dust, each movement heavy with exhaustion. He had left behind not just a house, not just land, but the bloodline he had raised with his own hands. Yet though his heart ached, he did not stumble in spirit. He told himself quietly, "A man must walk with dignity, even when cast aside." The night was cold. Coyotes cried in the distance, and the whispering wind pressed against his frail body. Still he moved forward. Hours passed. His legs trembled, but his will did not break. Finally, his strength gave way, and he sank to the ground beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees. There he sat, his blanket wrapped around him, shivering in the chill. He thought he would rest only for a moment, but the weight of his years pressed him into silence. When dawn broke, a faint sound stirred the stillness, the quiet hoofbeats of horses. From between the trees emerged riders, tall and proud, their hair braided, their faces marked with the calm strength of warriors. They were native people, a band moving with quiet purpose across the land. At first they thought they had found a dying man abandoned on the trail, but as they drew closer, they saw something different. The old man lifted his head with effort. His eyes, though weary, still held light. He looked at them, not with fear, not with pleading, but with dignity. That look alone gave them pause. In their culture, the gaze of an elder carried power. They saw not a beggar, but a man who had endured much, a man who deserved respect. One warrior dismounted, kneeling before him. "Grandfather," he said softly in his own tongue, a title of reverence, not of blood. "Why are you alone on this land?" The old man answered in broken words, his voice rough. "Because I was no longer wanted where I lived, cast out for being old." The warriors exchanged glances. Among their people, elders were never abandoned. Age was not weakness, but strength, for it carried memory, guidance, and the weight of all that had come before. To hear that this man had been thrown aside shocked them, and their silence deepened with grief and anger. They lifted him gently, not as if he were frail, but as if he were sacred. A young woman wrapped him in a woven blanket of her people, pressing warm food into his hands. Another brought water, lifting the cup to his lips with reverence. The old man felt tears prick his eyes, for these strangers treated him with a kindness that his own blood had denied him. The band led him back to their camp, a circle of lodges standing firm against the morning sun. Children peeked from behind, their mothers' eyes wide with curiosity at the strange elder who had entered their world. The old man was guided to a seat by the fire at the camp's center. There, the chief approached him, a man broad-shouldered, his face marked with years of wisdom. The chief studied him for a long moment, then he bowed his head slightly, an act of deep respect. "You are far from home, elder, but here you will not be left to die. Here you will be honored." The old man's voice trembled. "Why would you honor a man who is nothing to you?" The chief's eyes burned with quiet strength. "Because you are everything. You are living memory. You are proof that life can endure long roads and heavy burdens. Among us, the old walk before the young, for they light the path." Word spread quickly through the camp. Soon, men, women, and children gathered, circling the fire. They listened as the old man told fragments of his story, how he had worked the land, raised a family, built a home, only to be cast aside when his body grew frail. His voice was thin, but each word carried weight, and the people listened as though they were hearing a sacred tale. One young warrior stood, anger flashing in his eyes. "If my son were to cast me away like that, I would haunt him from the grave. That rancher has lost his soul." The chief raised a hand, silencing him. "Do not speak of vengeance now. This man carries no curse. He carries wisdom. We will honor him not with anger, but with reverence." The days passed, and the old man grew stronger under their care. He ate their food, drank their medicine, and sat with their elders around the fire. He listened to their songs, their drums echoing into the night, and in those rhythms he felt life flow through him again. He shared his own stories, the droughts he had survived, the cattle drives across endless plains, the battles of will against storm and famine. The people leaned closer when he spoke, for his words were not just memories, but lessons. One evening, the chief declared, "This man is not a stranger. He is now one of us. His blood may not be ours, but his spirit walks with our ancestors." And so they gave him a new name in their tongue, a name that meant, "He who carries the past." From that night on, he was no longer the abandoned rancher's grandfather. He was elder of the people, his place at the fire secure. When the rancher cast him out, he had thought the old man would vanish into silence, forgotten. But instead, something far greater happened. The old man had been lifted higher, placed in a circle where his age was not a burden but a crown. Soon word spread beyond the camp. Other bands heard of the elder who had been wronged by his own kin, but honored by the native people. One morning, the prairie shook with the sound of hooves. From every direction, riders arrived, warriors, elders, women, children. 200 in all. They did not come with weapons raised. They came with drums, with feathers, with songs of respect. They circled the old man where he sat, their voices rising in a chant that seemed to shake the sky itself. They bowed their heads to him, not as a castaway, not as a burden, but as a man whose worth was beyond measure. The old man wept quietly. He had lost one home, but he had found another, greater, stronger, filled with the respect his blood had denied him. He realized that honor did not depend on wealth or land or family name. True honor was given by hearts that understood the value of a soul. And far away in the great ranch house, the wealthy grandson sat in silence, unaware of the gathering. But soon he would learn what he had lost, when the sound of 200 riders carried across the land, not in war, but in reverence, for the man he had cast aside. The night after 200 natives gathered to honor the old man, the prairie seemed alive with quiet power. The fires burned high, shadows danced across the lodges, and the sound of drums echoed under the stars. But even as voices rose in songs of reverence. The old man sat silently, his eyes glistening with tears. He could not believe what his life had become. Only days earlier, he had been thrown out like a useless thing. Now he sat in the center of a people who treated him as a living treasure. He looked at the faces around him, warriors strong as oak, women carrying the weight of their families with grace, children wide-eyed with curiosity. And all of them, every last one, looked to him with respect. It was not pity they gave him. It was honor. For the first time in many years, he felt whole. The chief spoke loudly for all to hear. This man was cast out by his own blood, yet he has found his place among us. Tonight, we give thanks for his life. Tonight we declare him not a burden, but a gift. The people answered with a chant, their voices rolling like thunder across the plains. The old man closed his eyes and let it wash over him. His heart, which had been heavy for so long, felt light, but deep within, he knew the story was not finished. His worth had been restored among these people, yet the wound of betrayal still lingered. His grandson, the wealthy rancher, still lived in ignorance of what he had done. He had cast away his grandfather, thinking he had rid himself of dead weight. What he did not know was that by doing so, he had lost something priceless, something the natives now guarded with reverence. The next morning, the camp stirred early. Warriors rode out to hunt. Women prepared food. Children chased each other in play. The old man sat by the fire, watching, smiling. A young boy approached him with a carved stick, shyly pressing it into his hands. "It is yours, grandfather," the boy said softly. The old man's voice trembled. "Why do you give this to me?" The boy's answer was simple, but it pierced his heart. Because you are wise, and the wise should have something strong to lean on. Tears filled the elder's eyes as he gripped the stick. It was more than a gift. It was recognition. That night, the chief gathered the entire tribe again. 200 of us have come together, not for war, not for vengeance, but to show the world that no man with years upon him is without worth. This elder is proof. His story must be told beyond these fires. They lifted the old man onto a decorated seat of honor. Feathers, beads, and blankets were laid at his feet. One by one, the people came forward, bowing, offering gifts. Some gave food, others gave crafted tools, and still others gave nothing but a touch on his shoulder, a silent message. You are seen. You are valued. For hours, the ceremony continued. The old man's heart swelled until he thought it might burst. Never in his long life had he been honored this way, not even in his youth when his strength had been at its height. He realized something profound. His worth was not in what he could do with his hands, but in what he carried within his soul. Far across the plains, the wealthy rancher grew restless. He thought little of his grandfather after casting him out, but rumors began to reach him, whispers carried by traders, travelers, and townsfolk. They spoke of a gathering of natives, hundreds strong, who had come not for war but for a single old man. They spoke of songs sung in his honor, of gifts laid at his feet, of a name given to him that meant he who carries the past. At first the rancher laughed it off. They honor a frail old fool? Let them. But as the stories grew, unease gnawed at him. He had believed his grandfather to be worthless. Yet these stories said otherwise. The weight of shame pressed heavier each day until finally he could bear it no longer. He mounted his horse and rode out toward the lands where the natives gathered. His heart pounded, though he would not admit fear. When he arrived, the sight that met him froze him in his saddle. 200 natives stood in a great circle, their voices rising in song. At the center, seated with dignity, was the very man he had thrown out. His grandfather was clothed in fine blankets, a staff in his hand, feathers crowning his seat. The people bowed to him as though he were a chief. The rancher's breath caught in his chest. Never in his wealthy life had he been honored so. The contrast was too sharp. He, with all his land and cattle, was feared and respected in town, but never truly loved. Yet here, his frail grandfather was honored by hundreds. The old man raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting those of his grandson. For a long time, silence stretched between them. Finally, the grandfather spoke, his voice steady despite his age. You cast me out because you thought I was nothing. But look around you, boy. These people see my worth. They honor what you refuse to see. The rancher swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to justify, to defend himself. But no words came. For the first time in his life, he felt truly small. The chief stepped forward, his gaze stern. You are wealthy, yes. But wealth means nothing if you cannot see the treasure that sits before you. You threw away gold greater than your cattle, greater than your land. You threw away your own blood. The rancher bowed his head, shame burning his face. For days he stayed among them, watching. He saw how they listened to his grandfather, how they drew strength from his stories. He saw how even children treated the old man with reverence. And slowly, a truth sank into him. He had been blind. He had measured worth only in labor and profit. He had forgotten the power of wisdom, memory, and love. One evening, he knelt before his grandfather. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I was wrong." The old man studied him a long while. Then he nodded, though sorrow still lingered in his eyes. Forgiveness is given, but trust is not so easily rebuilt. Learn from what you have lost. The story of the elder spread far beyond the plains. Traders carried it. Townsfolk repeated it, and soon people across the land knew of the abandoned man who became a figure of honor. His name, he who carries the past, became a symbol, a reminder that elders were not burdens, but living treasures. The wealthy rancher returned to his home changed, his pride broken, his heart heavy with lessons. But the old man never left the camp again. He had found his place among the natives, where his worth was celebrated, not ignored. And when he finally passed, years later, 200 voices rose once more in song. They sent him on his final journey, not as a burden, not as a castaway, but as a man of honor beyond measure.